All right, so partly so we can get people moving again. Raise your hand if you were at the very first one of these 3 years ago. A couple. How many of you were here last year? All right, how many of you been here all 3 years? Okay. So some things that might not have been said at the beginning that I just want to call out. This kind of came out of some stuff that Gene Kim and I did at RSA in 2012, I think, was the first time we tried to introduce the idea of DevOps and security being potentially at odds or potentially wonderful teammates. And I think we've kind of crossed the chasm. If you look at the reports from Gartner and other things, people are finally realized that yes, this thing's real, yes, it's here to stay, and there's good and bad ways to adopt and embrace. The idea, though, for calling it, and now there's going to be debates on what to call it, and honestly, I kind of don't care what you call it. I care that you do it as best as possible. But there are notions of DevSecOps, SecDevOps, DevOpsSec. One of the things we tried to focus on in the Rugged DevOps name, just so for the people who weren't here before, the Rugged Software Manifesto was written, I think, closer to 8 years ago. And part of the idea was if you look at the Agile Manifesto, which is transformative to the way software is written, it's very cherished and appreciated by the development population we wish to affect. And in it didn't really say anything about security or risk or adversaries. It just seemed to not be aware of the environmental hazards that software faces increasingly. So what we wanted to do was create our own manifesto that could be compatible with the development tribe, not conflictual. And what we found in talking with them and going to their conferences is security is a bad word. It's a dirty word. It's a pejorative. And there's reasons for that. Typically it's because we're the Department of No, and it's a cost and an inhibitor, the cost coming out of zero sum. So it's not to be self-loathing of our security tribe, but we deliberately avoided security because why would you start in the hole? Why would you start from a position of adversarial tone or weakness? Especially when the tone of DevOps was so conciliatory and empathy driven. So just as you pursue these things, I'd like you to consider that. And the second thing we found out is that the DevOps leaders, many of which you've spoken to today, whether you realize this or not, the first few speakers were not security people. They're the movers and shakers of the global DevOps movement. They found willing allies in the Rugged tribe. So we tried to move these two tribes together for mutual benefit. And again, the key was empathy. And when you finally build trust with people like, Bacha Gloop or John Willis or Jez or whatnot, you're going to hear from Damon later. They'll confess that they really don't like people messing with their term DevOps. Leave it alone. There's DevOps days. There's the global DevOps movement. Why are these security people going to come save us from ourselves? So I would encourage you. It's less about what you call it, but I would consider the audiences we wish to reach and embrace and work with in your choices of how to do this. More than what we call it, I encourage you to really be that helping hand instead of the pointing finger, and to shift as far left in the SDL as you possibly can to drive real value, because we have never seen the willingness to engage and redefine how we drive value into the business than we have with these pioneers in the DevOps tribe. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm feeling a little punchy today, so I'm going to be a little more aggressive than normal, in part because I like you guys. So let's see. I'm going to talk about life and death stuff, so I was really happy to see the Westrom work because we're learning from each other. So how many of you guys have heard of IamTheCavalry.org? How many of you participate in it? Right. One of the most common questions I get, even from Gene Kim when we were first working on this stuff, is he's like, what the hell does DevOps have to do with public safety and human life? And the answer is everything. Everything. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to convince you of that, but I'm going to try by the end here to let you understand that the people in this room, if we're going to come up with better, more defensible, more reliable digital infrastructure that affects public safety and human life, this is the room that's going to do it. People like you that are trying to figure out better ways to work with development, operations, and security. I don't know if we can figure out safer dependence on digital infrastructure, but I know this is the kind of room that's going to figure it out or not. So the idea behind this is we were deeply concerned with public safety, human life issues in the Internet of Things, in hackable vehicles, medical equipment, hospitals, critical infrastructure. And we looked for all the adults in the room in Washington or in public policy makers, and we couldn't find any. So the genesis of the name was that if the cavalry isn't coming, that means it falls to you. to be that voice of reason, to be that ambassador, that translator, that educator, to be that helping hand instead of pointing finger. And I want to say to my DevOps friends, I think a huge part of the success of the Cavalry the last 3 years, I learned from you guys. It was the empathy at the heart of DevOps. It wasn't our technical prowess, it was our willingness to look and listen and help and engage and look for what's workable, not what's wrong. Look for what we could encourage, not what we had to point and make fun at. So does anybody know this picture? If you've seen me speak, you've probably seen me use this before. Anybody know what this is? It's a little hard to make out. Somebody quick. So this is the Cuyahoga River in Ohio in flames. So a burning river on fire due to pollution. Now this was not the first time the river caught on fire. It had caught on fire over 20 times between the late 1800s and 1971 before we finally said, you know, it's probably not a good thing that rivers are catching on fire due to pollution. So later on, after you saw this picture show up in Time magazine, the public consciousness tipped and you saw things introduced like the Clean Water Act and ultimately parts of what now constitute the EPA. But things had to get pretty darn bad, like massive property damage every time the fires happen. They burned bridges down and had to rebuild bridges. If you've ever seen a bridge built in your town, it takes a long time. So we knew that when we launched the Cavalry, we were probably going to have to see the first fatalities due to connected medical equipment before we'd see substantive change. In fact, a policy lawyer told us this story, and it really stuck with us. But what we realized is if you wait for this Cuyahoga River on fire moment, you're too late. You have to start building the trust and the scaffolding now. You have to start hacking the incentives now. You have to start inculcating the development schools and the practices and the tip of spear for things like if the DevOps people are ruling the world, and one of the things that John and I talk about sometimes when we would co-present is if you think about guns, germs, and steel, right? The idea that there are certain disruptive technologies which are just massively dominant and crush their competition. They change the game forever. If you think about that software is eating the world line from Andreessen, a corollary to that is whoever's best at software wins. So if we can be the reason that these software winners are winning, or if we can be in the mix, even falsely correlated with the mix, we can force more adoption of good hygiene and good security patterns. If we sit on the sidelines and throw pot shots and say how reckless and irresponsible it is, we're gonna squander that opportunity. So we knew we had to be in front of this with the Cuyahoga River. But I'm gonna say some things that started happening last year on stage, but I'm gonna remind you guys what happened. Last year was a terrifying year if you're into cyber safety issues. We've known that cybersecurity and power grids could be hacked for a long time, and honestly, I'm less concerned about grids, but you finally had on the record public confirmation of the ability to disrupt power grids using hacking. You also had a lot of evidence start to become unsealed. We've known these things, but there were documents unsealed that showed people using tools like Shodan to find industrial control systems directly connected to the internet and actually manipulating them. This was a water facility with a floodgate that was successfully manipulated by Iranian hackers in upstate New York. Now the good news, and I think one of the reasons we picked this one to unseal from the Justice Department, is there was no water in it, and at worst it would have flooded a golf course. But this shows an existence proof of ideological adversaries successfully manipulating bits and bytes to cause a physical impact, right? The one that really bothers me, and some of you know it bothered me so much that I left my private sector job, but last spring, Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital in Southern California got hit by ransomware. Just like a lot of hospitals have been hit by ransomware, but they didn't know what to do with it in time, and they shut down patient care. They diverted ambulances to another facility. I don't know if you've ever been in an ambulance, but it's probably the most terrifying moment of your life. And how'd you like to be en route to getting care where seconds matter, and you gotta go somewhere else, even if it's 3 blocks up the street? How is that acceptable due to a software flaw? You know, and I was gonna leave this punchline to the end, but let me make it really concrete for you. A lot of you guys know I pay attention to software supply chain hygiene, the idea that third-party and open source libraries, we have lots of known vulnerabilities and we don't pay attention to them. Do you know that the thing that enabled Hollywood Presbyterian to shut down was the Java deserialization bug in a known vulnerability in JBoss? And do you know that it was entirely avoidable because all the hospitals were told about it, but none of the hospitals can answer 2 simple questions. Am I affected, and where am I affected? So they got hit, even with warning, they got hit right between the eyes. Now, this is the Hollywood Presbyterian one. But let's make this a little scarier. And I'm not a fan of FUD, but sometimes the truth is damn scary. Some of you guys know I researched Anonymous for a few years, right? The rise of hacktivism. I thought it was material, not because they were talented, but because they were aggressive. Now, one of the pockets of Anonymous, there were very, very few hackers in the global collective. A lot of people thought this was this massive hacker army. There was actually very, very few hackers. And when we wrote about it, we said we are less concerned with Anonymous itself and more concerned with the blueprint it represents, because that blueprint will be copied and perfected by others. And we speculated as to ideological groups with a more clear purpose and clear agenda. And what we didn't know at the time, because it didn't exist at the time, it's absolutely, in fact, we actually made that blueprint graphic. But it's absolutely the case. If you look at the cyber caliphate from ISIS and ISIL, they have perfected the blueprint of Anonymous. Their use of social media for recruiting, for coordination is masterful. The West is completely gobsmacked at what to do about it. But let's get really, really concrete. One of the only hacking crews in all of Anonymous is Team Poison. One of the hackers from Team Poison with the handle of Trick. We now know his real name because he was killed with a drone strike. Trick lived in Birmingham, UK. If you want to understand which hacks he did, go read up on it. But he was one of the guys defacing Tony Blair's website and doing a lot of anti-government things in the UK from the comfort of his home in Birmingham. But at some point after our research was done, he moved from Birmingham to Raqqa, Syria. He joined the Cyber Caliphate. He was recruiting and training before being killed. Now, he was not a very talented hacker, right? Let's even call it in the realm of a script kiddie. But how much damage do you think you can do with Metasploit, with Shodan, with Kali Linux, with free attack tools on this hyper-connected, insecure equipment, like I talked about in the Iranian facility, the Iranian water facility? So think about Trick meets Hollywood Presbyterian. Now, gratefully, he was killed before Hollywood Presbyterian revealed itself. But if an accident can take out an entire hospital, what could Trick do? And his crew is still alive and operating. So this is getting fairly serious, guys. Now, it's not about if it will happen, it's when it will happen, and how will we respond. And one of the things I love about the measurements of DevOps is it's not just about failures, it's about mean time to resolution, right, MTTR. So were we to have our deep water horizon, is it going to be fixed with a patch? Is it going to be fixed in 24 hours? Or is it going to be days and weeks of months of us being unable to stop denial of patient care on many US hospitals? And one of the scary things, some of you guys know I serve on the Congressional Task Force for Health and Human Services. We're almost done our one-year project. And we kind of joke that the 20 members of this task force, that being on it is hazardous to our health. Because a lot of us knew some of the really serious exposures in the clinical environment, but none of us knew the whole picture. And as we put our heads together, we started seeing it's far worse than any of us could have imagined. And just to give you a few data points here, we can't just like throw security resources at it. 75% of the health delivery organizations in the US have 0 security staff. 0. So they're not going to be patching this. They're not going to take an indicator of compromised threat intelligence feed and go fix it. There's no one to receive it or act upon it. So if you've got these devices, like, well, let's hope that they're really high hygiene devices. Maybe the regulatory bodies will fix it. Billy Rios took a look at one single device and reported it to DHS ICS CERT. It had 1,400 known vulnerabilities in it. And that's an average typical device. You know, most of these devices are running on Windows XP or earlier operating systems, which are no longer supported by the operating environment. So if one JBoss flaw in one device in a clinical environment can shut down a hospital, what could we do with 1,400 known vulnerabilities per device times all those devices with no security staff to shake a stick at? So this should not comfort any of you, right? Now, a lot of us talk about boiling the ocean and we get very nihilistic. You know, security nihilism is legion in our industry. But one thing I'd like to maybe do, and now that I'm working in public policy circles at the Atlantic Council, we are trying to figure out some way to be rational and measured about this. Now, this is a terrible graphic, but I'm hoping it's sufficient to at least facilitate the discussion. When we talk about hacking and defense and everything, one of the things I've said many years ago is that I was at Fort Meade and I was asked, how does the hacker community look at our capabilities for cyber command? You know, what do you guys think of us? And my answer was instinctual, but pretty clear. I said, I think we're I assume we're really, really good at offense. I assume we're really, really bad at defense. We probably take solace in the assumption the same is true for our adversaries, but we've forgotten we've got much, much more to lose. And I really want you to think about those four things in concert. We know that in the state of nature and the state of cybersecurity is a state of offense. And we know that even if we doubled our defensive capability, it wouldn't be enough to stop most of our adversaries. The balance is just so far out of whack. So when we talk about talented adversaries and advanced persistent kitten-killing threats, and when we walk the show floor and we look at the FUD about sophisticated adversaries, they do exist. They absolutely exist. And if we got twice as good at defense, it still probably wouldn't stop them. But we tend to focus on capability. What I want to do is, for a moment, let's talk about intent. So not just capability, but capability times intent. Now, we absolutely have to do things to raise our base hygiene, and I think things like rugged DevOps are a beautiful chance to do so. But look at the non-state actors. Look at the hacktivists, look at the lone wolf, look at the cyber caliphate type people. They're nowhere near as capable. They are using essentially these script kiddie tools and known vulnerabilities, or at least familiar hacking skills. So raising the security level sufficiently high enough, let's call it hygiene, raising the cyber hygiene could exhaust their capacities. And those are the low-hanging fruits that shouldn't break the software industry for us to adapt and integrate. These are things like don't use known vulnerabilities. Use higher quality open source projects, use the least vulnerable versions of those and track where they go. These are principles you've heard from me for the last few years through the software supply chain ideas. Now, it really won't stop the nation states, but one of the things we forget is that when we have nation state level adversaries or organized crime, we can use diplomatic sanctions, we can use economic sanctions, we can go to the UN and NATO, we can use mutually assured destruction. They're more rational. So right now, for the sake of safety, I'd like you to consider the high intent, low capability actors and the benefit that some level of minimum 80-20% kind of rule for cyber hygiene might represent for our families and our way of life. So if we can raise that tide line sufficiently, if we can get ourselves, I used to have this notion that don't look at 0 days, just look at known vulnerabilities. And then we pressed a little harder. I said, you know what, don't look at known vulnerabilities. Don't even look at the CVSS 10s and 9s, look at what's in Metasploit. So I called it HD Moore's Law. If you could fix the things in Metasploit, it was 30 times more likely to be exploited than things that weren't in Metasploit. So that was a good prioritization exercise, right? But then I realized there's actually a level below that I won't actually spell out. I called it SOS. If you're an industrial control system, get your something off Shodan, right? If you're discoverable on the naked internet, that's probably your first step, right? So these are the kind of things where a high intent, low capability adversary could be. So not the best graphic, but I'm hoping it's at least coming through that we could do some basic things that would have a material impact on reducing the number of players on the field. And what's worse for these other players is they don't respond to UN sanctions. They don't respond to economic or diplomatic measures. They are undeterrable. So we have to treat them differently. So in the context of those things like Hollywood Presbyterian, I asked the task force on our very first meeting, and our report's pretty close to done. We're going to release it to Congress, I think, in April. One of the things I put on the table, I asked a simple question. You guys know the security cliche in this, this room has to know it, that security through obscurity is, somebody fill in the blank? It's no security at all, right? So I said, guys, are there any technical barriers to a sustained denial of patient care or any or all US hospitals right now? And the entire consensus of the room, the 20 people on the task force and the 20 support staff was no, there's no technical barrier. So I said, well, what if security through obscurity is all you have? And what we started doing is working backwards from the assumption that there's an attack like this tomorrow. What's our best case response time? That's why I put the Deepwater Horizon thing. And guys, it's not good. It's easily 5 years for the manufacturers of devices to get new devices into the market that have higher hygiene. And it takes about 10 years on average to rotate out the capital expenditure you've already bought. We're looking at a decade plus best case response time to materially changing our level of exposure to stuff like this. Now, maybe you don't care about the healthcare. Who's heard of the Mirai botnet, right? So Mirai's not sexy or special because of what you saw happen where it took out large chunks of the internet for a day by attacking Dyn DNS. That particular attack, I used to work at Akamai, the number of nodes in that botnet is unstoppable. The math doesn't keep up. I don't care what any of these guys tell you. If it wants to, it's bigger and stronger than any anti-DDoS solution there is or likely will be, right? It's just a numbers game. And only about 20% of that botnet was used, and they throttled the packet traffic on the ones that were used to about 20% of their full traffic. So there's a lot more attack capacity. And if you think about what happened after Christmas, how many new electronic devices got bought and deployed, this is not going to go away. Now, if you understand how Mirai worked, I basically talked about it in terms of DevOps, right? I said this is a tsunami of technical debt and security debt that is now coming back to crush us. And this is unpopular, but uncomfortable truths command uncomfortable responses. And one of the things I'm doing with the policy community is we have resisted for 30 years deliberately introducing things like software liability or accountability for flaws and harm caused by digital things. We have product liability for the physical world. We don't have any for software. And I'm not advocating for that here, but one of the most compelling arguments from the private sector is that if we introduce requirements for security, we may stifle innovation or hurt the economy. And what's really messing with policymakers right now on both sides of the aisle and both parts of Congress is Dine and Mirai kind of showed us if we don't regulate, we're going to hurt the economy, right? Large chunks of the internet taken offline and can be at will. And if you know on a technical level how it works, and Rob Graham's going to be presenting on it this week at the conference, that one didn't even use a known vulnerability. It just used a hard-coded username and password that you can't change on internet-facing devices. Well, guess what the really, really bad news is for healthcare? There's two implications from Mirai for healthcare. Number one is that first attack on Dine went after DNS infrastructure and was bigger than they could handle. The next target could be these hospitals who don't function when they can't access electronic health records. You can't find out the blood types, you can't do billing, you cannot administer care. So hospitals could be a target, for example, of the next Mirai attack with existing Mirai features. But somebody also published the source code for Mirai, so you can easily download it and point it at whatever username and password combo you'd like to. Do you know it's the norm for medical devices to have hard-coded maintenance passwords directly connected to the internet? Do you know that if you try to change them on most of these multi-million-dollar devices, they'll void your maintenance contract? So the next Internet of Things botnet may be multi-million-dollar medical devices that are keeping people alive. So a lot of these ideas that are being kicked around, like we should write white worms to go brick these devices, it's one thing when you want to go brick a bunch of IP-based cameras. It's another entirely when the next Mirai could be constituted from the Internet of Medical Things or industrial controls things. So one of the things I want to focus this crowd on is we do not have breathable oxygen yet. Part of the mission of Rugged, part of the mission of Rugged DevOps, part of the mission of combining our tribes, and absolutely part of the public policy mission of I Am the Cavalry has been that we have to do the terraforming. We have to do the early work to create breathable atmosphere. We have to establish these primitives that allow us to have trust, have empathy, have common vocabulary, and get stuff done. And that's a very different mission than breaking stuff. Now, I'm gonna have to skip this because I got the 5-minute warning, but there were two very different disclosures of medical device flaws, one in the St. Jude medical pacemakers, which was done through the public shorting of a stock, and it created a lot of shock and awe and lawsuits, and another was done through coordinated vulnerability disclosure in the FDA on Johnson & Johnson Animas insulin pump. One of them was fixed very quickly without lawyers, with patient care in mind. One of them took 5.5 months and is still not completely resolved, and there's still a pending lawsuit. And I'm going to be talking about some of that type of phenomenon on Friday if you're still at the show. But I'm going to have to skip this. But what we're learning is key to building this terraforming is trust. And we have to build it brick by showing positive, high trust, high collaboration with white hat research community, security professionals in these safety critical industries. And really, this is why I'm so grateful to John and Jez and Nicole and Gene and Damon and the people who really caused DevOps to be so powerful. Is I learned how to be effective on these safety things. The Cavalry learned how to be effective on these safety things by watching you guys set the example on how Dev and Ops people work together. We have to look for what is workable, and we have to meet them at their current level of knowledge and understanding and get them to the next adjacent possible step. Now, one area we've decided to do that, this is an eye chart, but you can download it. It's an infographic our friend made. In the last 2 years, we've had 18 different US government acknowledgements and endorsements of the value and critical necessity of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. This is the idea that you want to put out a welcome mat versus a beware of dog sign When we wrote our 5-star cyber safety framework for cars or for medical devices, we talked about all systems fail. You should be ready to tell your customers how you avoid failure, tell researchers you'll take help avoiding failure, how do you capture, study, and learn from failure, have a prompt and agile response to failure, and contain and isolate failure. But the real heart of this turned out to be if you can get the safety manufacturer to invite researchers acting in good faith to come report issues to them, if you put out that welcome mat instead of the beware of dog sign, if you can start to work together for a common purpose, we are dramatically accelerating the adoption of the other 4. So these are some of those primitives that we are here to help. We're not the enemy, right? There are actual adversaries, there are accidents in adversaries, and if you want to avoid a confidence destroying event, we have to focus on those. Okay. All right, really briefly, one of the ways that we try to instill empathy in the researchers themselves is we want to say IoT is very different than reporting a bug to an Internet Explorer browser bug, right? There's different adversaries, there's different consequences of failure, there's different context and operating environment. Sometimes these are migratory devices or in places you cannot reach. There's different composition of goods, so the hardware, firmware, software stack is quite different in an IoT and embedded. Very different economics and regulatory levers, and massively different time scales and time to live. In fact, somebody curious about medical, find me. One of our biggest problems is the time to live for a durable good is 15 years, and the time to live for a supported Windows operating system is 8. And the medical device approval process is 4+ years. So we've got really big structural engineering challenges. But back to that tsunami, it's triggered a bunch of things. I'm gonna choose my battles here. Okay. Actually, no, I want to say this one. So many of you guys saw this last year. I pointed out that some of the research I did on third-party open source supply chain turned into a bill that quickly died on purpose, but it was called the Cyber Supply Chain Management and Transparency Act of 2014. The idea was you should do 3 things. If you sold stuff to the government, and the purpose of this was really to trigger a public discussion on it. But if you sold stuff to the government, you should do 3 things. Publish a software bill of materials of the third-party and open source libraries that you use in your products with version numbers. Number 2, that list should not contain known vulnerabilities that have freely had fixes around for years without a justification. And number 3, since all products will fail, you want to have your products be patchable. So tell us the ingredients list. They should not be known vulnerable, and they must be patchable. Now, what happened after the bill was introduced for discussion and fights, and the Chamber of Commerce freaked out. The Financial Services ISAC said, you know, most of our risk comes from third-party IT risk that we don't know. We're getting hit by Apache struts, we're getting hit by Apache Commons collections, we're getting hit by OpenSSL, we're getting hit by Bash. So they started putting in procurement language, and they actually wrote an XML schema. They say, not only do we want a software bill of materials, here's the schema that you should use. They published it, and you can use it in your procurement language and say, if you want to sell to us, we need to know what's in the goods and what risks you're passing on to us. Number 2, Underwriters Laboratories introduced the Cyber Assurance Program, and it's in its early stages. But for medical devices and industrial control systems, they ask for those 3 things and then 4 more. They want to see static analysis, dynamic analysis, fuzzing, and human pen testing. And they'll capture the results as a higher level of assurance. And the whole purpose of this is that, think of the things like Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. If that one device had said, we're using this version of JBoss, and you found out on the news that this being attacked, you could find out, am I affected and where am I affected? And we probably could have avoided shutting down that hospital. And since I mentioned that story, the UK has shut down 4 other hospitals, the UK government through NHS. And we don't expect this to stop anytime soon because there really are no technical barriers to repeated use. So without going into them now, I'm just going to tell you some of these exist. But what we're trying to do with this terraforming and primitives is this is a list of first-of-a-kind US public policies that are starting to weave in some of these concepts of coordinated disclosure, software transparency, et cetera. So one important one is the Food and Drug Administration put out their post-market guidance saying we expect you to have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program. If a bug is reported to you, if you can fix it within 30 days or 60 days, we will not give you a recall. So they're creating a fast path to basically have a coordinated vulnerability process, and it's basically pushing DevOps processes on medical device manufacturers. Number 2, the DHS said, you know, there's a bunch of safety critical IoT. It's not just, you know, toaster ovens and whatnot. So for safety critical, they put out a bunch of stuff, including the encouragement of using software bill of materials, the notions of introduction, some form of software liability, et cetera, et cetera. The cars are trying to embrace the 5-star cybersecurity program through the Department of Transportation. Department of Commerce spent a year and a half publishing best practices for voluntary coordinated disclosure programs, and I help drive the safety critical working group where we have a draft template that fits on a single page of how you too can introduce your very first coordinated vulnerability disclosure program without a bug bounty, but just showing people how to get started so you can start attracting puzzlers and protectors to help you make your stuff safer sooner. And then lastly, the doozy before I drop the mic, I guess here. The Presidential Commission for Enhancing National Cybersecurity was a bipartisan, nonpartisan group that published their findings on December 1st. I helped testify to that. I know the new administration has read it. In fact, the guy for National Security Advisor for Counterterrorism, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity is a fellow of mine until he went into the White House. So they are processing some of these recommendations, but there's two in here that this room will have to embrace eventually. One of them says the DOJ should lead an interagency study with the Department of Commerce, Homeland, blah, 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 to assess the current state of the law with regards to liability for harm caused by software and faulty IoT devices. So there is an appetite to start looking at some form of accountability or reasonability, and I think that will hover around known vulnerabilities. And then lastly, they're encouraging some sort of task force to look at an IoT nutrition label or food label so people can tell good products from bad products. Now look, we're gonna have our Cuyahoga River moment. It might be dying in the ass, it might be a hospital shutting down, but when the moment comes, this community has got to have our act together so we know how to drive real value and real hygiene so that we can have more dependable digital infrastructure. My closing sentence is, by over-depending on these undependable things, we have created the conditions such that any single extreme individual could have a profound and asymmetric impact on human life, national security, GDP. We have to be better, and I think rugged DevOps and this kind of tribe and finding the best ways to drive value together is what better looks like. So I'd like to have each of you clap for yourselves because you're in this room trying to figure out what better looks like. So thank you.